Hello everyone, welcome to the program tonight, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality with Tanya Hernandez. Tonight's program is part of the Representation Matters series hosted by Arizona Humanities, and it's supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities United We Stand, Connecting Through Culture initiative. Arizona Humanities is a state chapter of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We support humanities programs in partnership with cultural and educational organizations across Arizona. And I'm just going to talk for a moment about the format of tonight's program before I introduce our speaker. So we will have a presentation with Professor Hernandez first, and that's going to be followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions for Professor Hernandez during her talk, please drop them in the chat, which should be located to the right of your screen. If you don't have a Google account, you can still submit questions using the Google form, which is linked below in the description, and I'll also drop it in the chat in just a moment. So again, if you have any questions during this talk, please add them to the chat because we'll do a live Q&A after the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Tanya Katerí Hernández is an Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law. Professor Hernandez is an internationally recognized comparative race law expert. Hispanic Business Magazine selected her as one of its annual 100 most influential Hispanics. She has previously served as a Law and Public Policy Affairs Fellow at Princeton University, a Faculty Fellow at the Institute for Research on Women at Rutgers University, a Faculty Fellow at the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, and as a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Professor Hernandez's work has been published widely, from university law reviews like Cornell, Harvard, NYU, Berkeley, and Yale, to news outlets like the New York Times, to her many book publications, including her most recent book, the subject of tonight's talk, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. We are delighted to have Professor Hernandez here tonight to talk about her book and the Afro-Latino community in the U.S. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Hernandez.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Tough topics, but necessary topics. So, an important challenge for racial justice that we face in our society, but that frequently gets overlooked, is the anti-Black bias that exists in communities themselves considered racial minorities. Indeed, the conundrum of how anti-Black bias can still be so pervasive decades after the achievements of the civil rights movement cannot be readily understood nor addressed with the traditional focus solely on white, English-speaking Anglo individuals. In the language of the U.S. Census Bureau, non-Hispanic whites are presently only 57% of the population and declining in numbers. This means that the ongoing upkeep and silent acceptance of anti-Blackness implicates many other racial groups and ethnic groups. Exploring Latino complicity in anti-Blackness is particularly helpful. The screen should be showing you right now an image for Hispanic Heritage Month that rarely gets broadcast. And the reason why I say it rarely gets broadcast is because all of the Latinos on the screen are Afro-Latinos. Indeed, as a multi-hued group, Latinos are often viewed as free of racism, even though we present a face that we're all white, or at least free of its most violent forms. Although examining how anti-Blackness still does manage to manifest itself amongst this racially mixed rainbow of Latinos is a powerful illustration of how people of color themselves can fortify racism. Indeed, it was only last year where the Los Angeles Times broke the story of a secretly recorded set of tapes of Nury Martinez of the Los Angeles City Council and her cohorts, all Latino, saying many anti-Black statements. The January 6th terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol included several Latino members of the white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, and their chairman, Cuban-American Enrique Tarrio, who was sentenced to 22 years in prison for the central role he played in organizing his followers to attack the Capitol. Just as the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville back in 2017 also included Latino attackers. The Southern Poverty Law Center has noticed that there is an increasing trend of more media reports of Latinos joining white supremacist hate groups and of Latino lone gunmen aspiring to be members. For example, here, Mauricio Garcia of Allen, Texas. The racial violence of Latinos is also evident amongst white Latino law enforcement members. During the time of protests for hashtag Black Lives Matter, the victims of law enforcement violence against blacks was lifted up. The name Sandra Bland was part of that, yet there was silence with regards to the fact that the person who instigated the violence against Sandra Bland was a white Latino law enforcement officer. Same with Philando Castile, another victim of anti-black law enforcement violence, but the law enforcement officer was a white Latino. Some of the white Latino law enforcement violence doesn't make the headline news, but is just as problematic. The violence is also evident amongst Latino opponents to hashtag Black Lives Matter. And yet, Latino white supremacists are not the only problem. Anti-blackness also shows up in Latino communities against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and other people of African descent in a myriad of contexts, such as the workplace, the rental and purchase of homes, the educational settings, public spaces of leisure, and the criminal justice or injustice system. Examining Latino agency and anti-blackness helps us better understand the complexities of racism and what is needed to be more effective in an increasingly racially diverse world. But before I discuss some of the details of Latino anti-Black bias and how it surfaces in a myriad of contexts in the US, I think it would be helpful if I first explain some of the origins of Latino anti-Black bias. Over 65 to 90% of the approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the Americas that survived the Middle Passage were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas only 3.5% were brought to what we now call the United States. It's a disproportionate intensity, right, of the African slave trade within Latin America and the wider Caribbean of all linguistic origins. Today, there are approximately 150 million people of African descent in Latin America, representing about 1/3 of the total population. And yet those numbers I just quoted to you are considered very conservative demographic figures because of the histories of undercounting the number of people of African descent in Latin America in their national census forms, and often completely omitting a racial or ethnic origin census question. At the same time, people of African descent make up more than 40% of the poor in Latin America and have been consistently marginalized and denigrated as undesirable elements of the population since the abolition of slavery across the Americas. Yet the view that racism does not exist is pervasive in the region, despite the advent of social justice movements and social science researchers demonstrating the contrary. When the BBC surveyed Latin Americans regarding the existence of racism, a significant number of the respondents emphatically denied it. And many explained it away by saying that Latin America wasn't racist because everybody is mixed. So the denial of racism is rooted in what many have critiqued as the myth of racial democracy. That is, the notion that racial mixture, mestizaje, in a population is emblematic of racial harmony and insulated from racial discord. Academic scholarship in over the last 30 years or more has critiqued Latin American mestizaje racial mixture theories as being emblematic of racial harmony. Yet Latin Americans on the ground, outside academia, still very much adhere to the notion that racial mixture and the absence of US-style Jim Crow racial segregation are such a marked contrast to the United States that the region views itself as what I call racially innocent. In part, the absence of a legal critique of the Latin American comparisons to the US Jim Crow South has enabled Latin American racial innocence to remain. This earlier book, Racial Subordination in Latin America, provides the legal critique. Specifically, the book is about the ways in which the Latin American denial of racism, operating in conjunction with the notion that true racism can only be found in the racial segregation of the US Jim Crow South, it argues that an examination of the role of the state after the abolition of slavery in Latin America in regulating race through immigration laws and customary law disrupts this picture of Latin America as racially innocent. The book assesses the ways in which the contemporary Latin American anti-discrimination laws are seeking to eradicate the legacy of racial inequality brought by the historic racism of the state. Today, the force of racism denial is so strong in Latin America that the very term black, negro, is widely considered derogatory and associated with animals. Right? This is because people of African descent are stereotyped and referred to as inherently criminal, intellectually inferior, overly sexual, and animalistic. Because the racialized stereotypes of people of African descent are pervasive, they are commonly understood to smell like animals, and in particular, monkeys. When Nori Martinez of the Los Angeles City Council refers to a black child as being like a monkey, this entire legacy of stereotyping was brought to bear. In addition to these commonalities in anti-black stereotypes across Latin America, each country in the region has developed its own subset of derogatory phrases for blacks and blackness. A review of newspapers in the region that meticulously traced how racialized stereotypes for blacks and anti-black sentiment is pervasive across media outlets in Latin America. Yet when I share this information about anti-blackness in Latin America, a frequent response makes note of how blackness is also used as a term of affection. However, the use of racialized language as terms of endearment unconsciously and sometimes consciously invoke the paternalism of slavery's past. So for example, affection in Spanish can be expressed by stating, "That's my black person, ese es mi negrito," or calling someone my little black person. What's that the ito suffix at the end is doing? Even compliments directed towards those who are black are reserved for those who are presumed to supersede their blackness by having other superior traits. Such racialized compliments include, "He's black but has the soul or the heart of a white person." "She's black but good looking." "He's black but well groomed and scented." While these statements are not meant to carry racial malice, the people who love you can also have anti-blackness and express it in what they think are loving ways. These statements also activate racial stereotypes about the inferiority of blackness. In fact, these perspectives about persons of African descent are so embedded in the social fiber of Latin American societies that black people's subordinated status is viewed as natural and logical. That's just how they are. Moreover, when flagrant instances of racist conduct are detailed in Latin American news media, they are understood to be the acts of aberrant individuals who do not represent the greater racial tolerance presumed to be part of Latin American culture. Indeed, Latin American racial denial is deeply embedded within racially hierarchical environments. This dualism has been historically facilitated by the deployment of strategic comparisons to the US racial regime that are meant to depict Latin America as innocent of perpetrating racism. This is why I call it the rhetoric of racial innocence. All of which is to say that the legacy of slavery with its anti-Black justifications is just as relevant to Latin America as it is to the US context. So, when people from Latin America and the Caribbean migrate to the United States, they bring along their racial baggage with them and transmit it across generations into US Latino culture. If we are going to embrace the idea of culture as being about food, language, music, dance, the border of what is culture doesn't stop with regards to racial attitudes. That's part of the package too, and it gets transmitted across generations. As disturbing as is the anti-Black aspect of Latin American national cultures, for many Afro-Latinos in the United States, the deepest racial scars are those inflicted within intimate familial structures. When it comes to Latino racism, the family is the scene of the crime. Racial trauma is instilled when Latino parents show preferential treatment to children with lighter skin and consistently make negative appraisals of Black racialized features, skin color, and hair texture. Contemporary Afro-Latina memoirs are replete with recollections of racialized familial slights and injuries targeting the darkest person in the family, even in the most diverse array of family skin types. Afro-Puerto Rican sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the famous author of Racism Without Races, describes the racially negative familial interactions as affecting a segregation between darker and lighter skinned family members. He gives examples of the way in which large family gatherings, like weddings, are emblematic of this familial segregation that has darker family members seated at separate tables from the lighter skinned family members. Families thereby operate their own intuitive Jim Crow systems. The implicit justifications for the racial segregation are continually reinforced with racist comments about Black family members and Blackness in general. Returning to Bonilla Silva, he recalls some of his aunts and even his own mother as saying to him, "Eduardo, those Black people do not have any class. You know, your Black aunt, she doesn't know any better because she's accustomed to living in crap." Similarly, Marta Cruz Jensen poignantly describes how her white Puerto Rican family members denigrated the Blackness of her Afro-Puerto Rican father and her siblings that inherited his brown skin tone, African facial features, and curly hair. Quoting her, she says, "We were una pena," a disgrace, a sorrow, and shame. Both sides of the family continually judged our looks. Whoever had the most clearly defined white features was considered good looking. I was constantly reminded to pinch my nose each day so it would lose its roundness and be sharper, more Caucasian, like those of my whiter brothers and sisters. My younger sister was openly praised for her long flowing hair, while I was pitied for my greñas, my long mane of tangly hair. Cruz Jensen often overheard her white-skinned Puerto Rican relatives ask her mother, in relation to her darker-skinned daughters, "How are you going to get them married?" In a related vein, Cruz Jensen's family constantly reminded her of her responsibility to marry someone lighter and hopefully whiter in order to improve the family's status. This is called adelantando la raza, improving the race. At the same time, she was also aware that for white Puerto Rican families to actually bring a Black woman into the sanctity of marriage and as a family member is an unbearable public nightmare, a real threat to the family's purity and public honor. Fellow Puerto Rican Lilian Comas Diaz also recounts instances of family racial trauma starting from early childhood when her lighter-skinned brother repeatedly called her molleta, black and ugly. In fact, Comas Diaz identifies the Latino family as the major source of racial rejection of family members with visible African ancestry. Scholar Hilda Llorens notes that the Latino community is a place where thousands of girls and women whose hair is other than straight suffer great psychic and psychological distress. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about racial politics. Family dynamics often filter interactions through a screen that imbues blackness as the source of all things negative. For example, when a colicky baby is disparaged, it's esa preta majadera, that bothersome black female baby. The family thereby hammers in the denigration of blackness. This is also the case when family caregivers yell invectives such as maldito sea este pelo, damn this hair, while combing curly Afro-descended curls. And cierra esa bemba, close your large African lips when silencing black children. Or when the backs of babies' ears are examined for the dangerous development of future dark skin color. In short, dark skin, curly hair, African bodily features evoke familial expressions of ridicule, rejection, and hostility, whereby the family nucleus is the incubator for inculcating anti-blackness. Indeed, even Latino children as young as 4 years old have higher risk of mental health problems the darker their skin is. Upon adolescence, the familial vigilance about blackness is intensified in the Latino project of pursuing and maintaining a semblance of whiteness. Again, the project of mejorando y adelantando la raza, improving and advancing the race by marrying lighter and ideally whiter partners. This means each potential suitor is sorted out for taints of blackness. Anthropologist Maritza Quiñones Rivera keenly felt the familial pressure to only date white men. Yet, when she met the family of her first white boyfriend, Latino, they called her unintelligent, dirty black woman, and slut. In Spanish, but I've translated for you. These racial boundaries are so deeply internalized that they transcend parental supervision and extend into the modernity of online dating. So this is not just about old timers with old ideas. This is about young people. In a study of Latino internet daters, because that's what the young people are, on the internet, dating. So of Latino internet daters in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Atlanta, it was found that across these diverse cities, with Latinos from different ancestral countries of origin, Latinos prefer dating whites and exclude dating blacks at about the same rates. Indeed, there are numbers for rejecting black suitors, like don't give me them as a possible match, even if my soulmate's in there, I don't want to see them. They reject possible black matches at approximately the same rates as white Anglo English speaking online daters as well. Now, here's where an intersectional analysis of the data probably would have given us even more stark information. And here's what I speculate. I speculate that if we had been able to see not just Latinos versus white English-speaking Anglos, but Afro-Latino responses separate from Latinos who either don't identify racially or identify as white, we were very likely would have seen an even higher rejection rate amongst those either white or non-racial identifying Latinos. Just a speculation, but everything else in my research indicates that that pattern is probably evident. Okay, so in looking at the ways in which the family lesson of racism is that any intimacy with blacks, and in particular black Americans, is absolutely taboo. Indeed, in a qualitative study of young adult children of Latino immigrants in Los Angeles suggests that immigrant parents send strong racialized messages about African Americans that deter their US-born Latino children from dating Afro-Latinos and African Americans who they're classmates with and meet in the course of their day. Yet, anti-black racism that arises outside of the unfortunately familiar US frame of Anglo-whiteness versus African-American bias can be mystifying for many people in the United States. And this is in part because US blackness is primarily conceived of as embodied solely by English-speaking African-Americans. In turn, anti-blackness is then understood as a unique US phenomena affecting those English-speaking African-Americans, with an occasional recognition of the racialized struggles of Africans and others in the African diaspora. Civil rights leaders are also seemingly reticent to air the dirty laundry of the bias that exists within communities of color, lest it distract from the real racism of white supremacy. However, all the while, Afro-Latinos and African Americans suffer from acts of discrimination at the hands of Latinos who claim that their racially mixed cultures immunize them from being racist. And this is why I extend this idea about racial innocence from Latin America to Latinos in the US. That this is Latino racial innocence, a cloak that veils Latino complicity in US racism. In turn, the public ignorance about Latino anti-Blackness undermines the ability to fully address the interwoven complexities of US racism in developing public policies and enforcing anti-discrimination law. Judges and the rest of society need to learn that Latinos can be racist too. In the recent book, Racial Innocence, I excavate the otherwise silenced voices of Afro-Latino and African American victims of Latino anti-Blackness from the case files of discrimination charges. And in examining the discrimination claims of Latino anti-Blackness, two central patterns become evident. First, Latino anti-Blackness is more prevalent and serious in its consequences than many commentators in politics and in the media care to admit. Second, the ability to identify and address Latino anti-Blackness is hampered by the notion that Latinos cannot be prejudiced or racist simply by virtue of being Latino. It is for this reason that the tales of Latino anti-Black discrimination recounted in court cases and in interviews that I conducted are so important, inasmuch as they help clarify and disrupt the Latino myth of racial innocence and show Latino agency in racism. The interrogation of the pseudo-defense that Latinos cannot be prejudiced is especially illuminating for the legal enforcement of anti-discrimination law. Let me give you some examples. When Eddie Frazier, an African-American man, wanted to rent an apartment in a suburban community, it was a Latino homeowner who refused to consider his application. The Latino landlord instead chose to wait 3 more months for a non-Black applicant to surface. This is usually very clear-cut example of housing discrimination. Right? A landlord, it's against the landlord's financial self-interest to forego 3 months of a rent roll because they can't pay their mortgage and the like, and wait around for a non-Black applicant. Yet, a jury was persuaded that no racial discrimination had occurred due to the fact that the owner was a Latina who denied harboring racial bias because she was of mixed heritage, even though she didn't look it, and numerous of her relatives had Black and Indian ancestry, meaning indigenous. Juries are not alone, though, in being misled about Latino agency in racism. The case of Maxine Sprott is very helpful. Maxine, an African-American woman who worked in a government office, alleged that her Hispanic supervisor, Rosalind Reyes, harassed her with derogatory comments about her work performance, despite Maxine repeatedly receiving positive performance evaluations such as very good and good. For instance, Director Reyes insinuated that even though Maxine had many educational credentials, that she did not have any grasp of the nature of her work as it related to identifying and investigating claims that came before this office. Each positive performance evaluation from the office for Maxine was then followed by negative commentary by her supervisor, Rosalind Reyes, commenting on Maxine's lack of leadership skills in her role as a deputy director. When Maxine could no longer withstand the onslaught of derogatory commentary about her competence, she filed a claim of discrimination with the general manager. Exactly 3 days after Maxine files her claim, the director submits a performance evaluation that for the very first time rated Maxine as marginal And as a result, Maxine was denied a managerial merit salary increase. Now, any expectations that Maxine might have had that working in a government office that has strict, anti-racist policies, that this would be a more racially enlightened workplace, these ideals were shredded when her employer not only failed to investigate her allegations, but then retaliated against her for filing the claim. In fact, it was yet another Latino, Chairman Ruben Franco, that discriminatorily retaliated against Maxine. To be specific, when Maxine refused to continue being silent about what she was experiencing, Cuban Franco informed her that she was being transferred to another office where her material responsibilities would be diminished, and she was moved from a well-furnished private office into a cubicle, hence the graphic. Anyone who's worked in a workplace knows that when you can't make a phone call in private, you can't eat a sandwich in privacy for 2 minutes, that it's not quite the same thing. It's a demotion, right, when they throw you into a cubicle. This was yet another instance of retaliation for Maxine's exercise of her right to assert a claim of discrimination. Only when she files the claim in court was she able to exert enough pressure to then reach a settlement agreement and receive financial compensation. Now, while any number of concerns may have influenced Maxine and her attorney to consider settling the case rather than moving forward with a jury trial, one contributing factor could very well have been the great significance the judge placed upon office Latino racial diversity as mitigating claims of discrimination. So remember, the story is all about the judge. So for the judge, it was irrelevant that when Chairman Franco transferred Maxine into her little itty-bitty cubicle and into her lesser position, at the same time that he decided to terminate 2 other African-American women as part of his reorganization plan, but this was irrelevant. Instead, the judge concluded that these facts failed to raise an inference of discrimination because, and here I'm quoting, the new director is a Hispanic woman. The remaining staff is comprised of 24 Hispanics, 23 African Americans, 9 Caucasians, and 1 person categorized as other. So the judge here accorded a Latino-dominated workplace and the supervisor's Hispanic status great power to circumvent racism. Herein then is the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be the bearers of racism. A corollary of the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be the bearers of racism is the judicial notion that all Latino places of origin are racial equivalent, so people from one place replacing another, it's all the same thing. There can possibly be any racism. The case of Arrocha provides a useful illustration. Jose Arrocha, a self-identified Afro-Panamanian tutor of Spanish, sued his university employer for the failure to renew his appointment as an adjunct instructor. Jose alleged that the Latinos who directed the department where he worked discriminated against Black Hispanics, I'm using Jose's language, and that there was a disturbing culture of favoritism that favored the appointments of, and here again I'm using his language, white Cubans, Spaniards, and white Hispanics from South America. Yet the court dismissed his claims because there was not an understanding by this judge of the ways in which a color hierarchy informs how Latinos experience racism and national origin bias from other Latinos. Right? In other words, Latinos are not a harmonious pan-ethnic grouping. The dismissal of the case, right, so it doesn't go to trial, it just gets thrown out by the judge. The dismissal of the case by the judge was justified based on the fact that 5 of the 8 adjunct instructors that were reappointed instead of Jose were natives of other South and Central American countries, such as Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. The judge explicitly states in the court opinion, diversity, Latino diversity in an employer's staff undercuts an inference of discriminatory intent. This is not the actual law. From statute, from established case law precedent, what it is a judge intuiting a new way of thinking about racism because the people before him are not white Anglo versus African American. This is a judge who doesn't think that the usual legal rules apply because it's not the usual players. Okay. Instead, the judge infers this non-discrimination from the presumption that Latino ethnic subgroups are all interchangeable and homogeneous. This perspective fails to appreciate the ways in which internal Latino national origin bias is rooted in a racialized hierarchy of Latin American countries, where countries perceived or touted as more European are viewed as advanced and cultured, as opposed to those more significantly populated by people of indigenous descent or African descent. So let's go back to that list where the judge found they were all the same thing, indicating then the absence of national origin bias. They hired Latinos, so it's not about Latino racism, and it can't be any other kind of racism. Latin American racial constructs would instead rank Argentina as a highly valued white country, followed by Peru and Mexico, with the perspective that they are more dominated by an indigenous population, and most derided in this rank order would be the Dominican Republic and the complainant's own country of origin, Jose's country of origin of Panama, because of the perceived dominance by more African descended people. For Latinos influenced by Latin American racial paradigms, where each country has a racial identification, a diverse workforce of Latinos is not the immediate equivalent of a bias-free context, nor is a color preference divorced from a racialized ideology within the Latino context. It's also important to note that Latino anti-Black bias shows up not only as an expression of individual racial attitudes, but also in systemic structures of exclusion. In Hunt versus Personal Staffing Group, Latino employees of a Chicago-based nationwide job placement agency described how their Latino supervisors trained them to exclude African Americans from job placements in favor of Latino applicants. They were instructed to automatically reject African American applicants because of the stereotype that blacks were not capable of working as hard as Latinos. The lawsuit details how dispatchers who dissented and who nevertheless sent African American job seekers to a job site would later be reprimanded by their Latino bosses for doing so and threatened with termination. The placement agency would start the day by separating out Hispanic job applicants from the African Americans. They would enter the Hispanic applicants' contact information into a database so they could be easily reached and followed up with when jobs open. African Americans rarely received the same treatment. Instead, Black applicants were instructed to go to the central office at dawn to wait for assignments that rarely ever came. One agency dispatcher testified, and here I'm quoting her, "If it was 10 Mexicans that would come at 1:30 in the afternoon and 25 African Americans that were there since 4:30 in the morning and were waiting to be sent to work, the agency would send the Mexicans first." This Latino-run employment agency effectively ensured a secondary racial caste system of Latinos over Blacks in the already segregated Chicago area labor market that privileges Anglo-whiteness. So to wrap up, before I guess the hot questions start flowing in, I'd like to address the concern I often hear that people of color cannot be racist because they do not have power. When Latinos, and other people of color for that matter, are active participants in the denial of access to an important life opportunity, a home, a job, an education, enters into a public space, all based on race, these Latinos are no longer just passive holders of an anti-Black cultural prejudice. They are part of the problem of racism. Certainly, none of the victims of anti-Black bias and the narratives of discrimination I examined in my research would be placated with the disclaimer, but your experience is not an example of racism because Latinos do not have the systemic power to be racist in white Anglo-created structures. One can certainly and immediately envision such a victim responding something of, oh yeah, that so-called non-racist is the one who oppressed me for being Black. A Latino claim of racial innocence in the racist world white Anglos created in the US is a very thin reed of moral superiority when a Latino hand is the one forcibly slamming the door to Black inclusion. So the book is more than just a call for recognizing that Latinos can be prejudiced too. Rather, it's an entreaty for all future interventions into matters of racism to critically engage how Latinos and many others collaborate and sustain structures of racism. By recognizing that they are part of the problem, that we are part of the problem, interventions can also address Latinos as part of the solution. Judges and juries can be taught to desist from being distracted by the "I can't be racist, I'm Latino" pseudo-defense to accusations of discrimination. In short, dismantling racism in the United States requires that every component of its structures be taken apart, even the ones articulated en español. We do this by being racially literate about Latino anti-Blackness and engaging in meaningful coalition work. Let me give you some examples. A national organization of Blacks and Latinos together fighting for better immigration reform. A community-based organization in Los Angeles working together across race and ethnic lines. A Boston example. I want you to see we cover the country looking for the good, meaningful coalition work. And so I want to end on that positive note before we get into some nitty-gritty questions. And I thank you very much for your attention. I also want to let everybody know that the Spanish version of the book will be coming out in August.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernandez, for a wonderful talk. And thank you for our audience for tuning in today. I see we have people from Tempe, Phoenix, and Tucson. It's great to see folks from all across Arizona joining today. I'd like to invite our virtual audience to go ahead and ask questions in the chat or in that Google form linked in the chat. And then we'll get to some questions that we have now. So clearly there's little understanding of the color hierarchy or the racial hierarchy when we're talking about these places of employment. Are there any movements to do more like HR training so that people understand that kind of hierarchy in the Latino community? I'm just kind of thinking about those cases in Silicon Valley where they're trying to do a little bit more studies of, you know, the caste system in India and trying to familiarize themselves with that. Is there anything similar happening, you know, to understand the hierarchy in the Latino community?
Well, when I meet with human resources people, like, you know, we counsel one another at conferences and the like, what I often am confronted with, right, are people who are working in these fields, but they don't have any understanding of this. So they don't know to say that we need to do this training. And there aren't enough Latinos themselves who are also racially aware, right, who can make the demands for that kind of training to happen. And so it's sort of like a grassroots way of coming forward with all of this. Where I have done some training in places of employment, including the folks in HR, has been when there have been Afro-Latino representatives, workers in the office who are then putting in that internal pressure to identify the problem and then to ask for the help. I'll give you an example of sort of like the way in which the HR dynamic can happen. First of all, just from a statistical perspective, the primary demographic of people who are working in HR offices are white women, white Anglo-speaking women. And so that means that there's also a lack of awareness just because it's not in their world experience, roughly speaking. Obviously, there are always exceptions. So there's that. In addition, when there are other people of color in HR, I'll give you an example, African American women, those that would be like sort of the next level, right, of people who you see more statistically prevalent in those roles. They too don't always understand what's going on. So I once got this outreach from a Black HR officer who said, you know, I want to talk to you about these ideas I see you talking about in the newspaper and what have you. And she said, I once was called in to resolve a dispute at one of our field offices because these two women were just like could not work on the team together. They were always having problems. And the field office was mystified at we knew what they could do. And she said, but because I'm Black, I could see right away that these women were having a cultural dispute with one another. One was from the Dominican Republic, and I think one was from Mexico. I may have gotten that wrong, but in other words, they were from different parts of Latin America. And she said, because of my Black background, I could see that this was sort of like an internal Latino ethnic origin dispute. Right? Then I said to her, were they the same skin shade? No. One was darker, one was lighter, etc. I said, that may have been not only intercultural disputes, but also race ones. Right? To say that someone's from the Dominican Republic and say that someone is from Mexico, that comes with a sense of a racial proxy. Latinos are so attuned, right, to thinking about race, even though we deny that we are, that we associate particular races with each country of origin. And so what it means is that what we need is much more racial literacy before we can even have HR people who know to make that claim or demand, right, for the training.
Right. Thank you. That was a great response. Thank you so much. Earlier in the presentation, we were kind of taking a look at the BLM movement and the kind of reactions from the Latino community here in the United States. But I was wondering if there's any parallel BLM movement happening in Latin America, because I know it's a global movement that started here. What's happening in Latin America, and are there also movements of like allyship that we're seeing too?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, because I want to back up for a moment related to this very same question. In that often people say to me, Afro-Latino, what's that? Oh, and I should also say that I use "o" because I'm an old person, and that's kind of what automatically flows out of my mouth. But I embrace all who say that they prefer to identify themselves as a Latinx or Latine or Latina/O. I'm good with all of it. I don't have any particular agenda by using "o." It's just kind of what flows out of my mouth. Okay, so people often ask me, what is this Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx thing? Like, I don't understand. Where did this word come from? And they think it's some brand new thing that people of color are making up for themselves here in the United States. And what they do not understand is that this is a term that traveled to the United States and which young people started to embrace. Right? Why? Because in Latin America, for decades now, the Afro-Latino movement, or what first began identifying itself as an Afro-descendant movement, we're working across borders. So it's transnational organizing, so much so that in the 2001 World Conference Against Racism held by the United Nations in Durban, South Africa, Afro-Latinos were some of the heaviest represented at the convening. Why? Because they wanted to embarrass their nation states in an international platform by bringing the tales of how they were being oppressed within their nation states. You apply a little international law and human rights advocacy there on the ground. So this language of Afrodescendiente then transforms itself, or Afro-descendants, into Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latinx, and that then crosses borders into the United States. Okay. I bring that up because similarly, when hashtag Black Lives Matter is happening here in the United States, Latinos in the US start across racial identities, say that they are in allyship, right? And so they say that, we are here to support Black Lives Matter. But not taking account of the ways in which it was not just an outsider helping allyship, it was also Afro-Latinos on the ground saying, las vidas negras importan también. So meaning that Black Lives Matter in the Latino community just as much as in the African American community. It matters across the diaspora. Mm-hmm. And indeed, you would see placards in Brazil, as vidas negras importam, right? Black Lives Matter, it being held by Black Brazilians in allyship, but also elevating their own predicaments and being victims of the subordination based on race. And so the allyship, the activism, since before the World Conference Against Racism, is a very real thing. And in the United States, we don't tend to see much of this because we think in very shall I say, parochial terms, right, about what civil rights means, or what we pay attention to, and what's invisible, right, is all this activism happening across linguistic groups and across regions.
Thank you so much. Great question from Sonia here. In your study, is there more anti-Black bias greater in Latino countries where the Spanish culture is stronger versus countries where there are more acceptable indigenous culture?
I didn't mean to snicker at the question, but I often am asked, not this very question, but sort of similar questions, where folks are hoping to have like a sense of it's got to be better somewhere, right? I mean, and it comes from a very sort of deeply felt like wanting a better world, and I'm with you there, sister. I would like this better world too, but sort of qualitatively and quantitatively speaking, we don't have a sort of ranking of oppression, but at the same time, if we listen to victims, tell their stories, they don't sound much better in Peru as opposed to Argentina, as opposed to Chile, as opposed to Venezuela, as opposed to Cuba, right, where there is at least a socialism to try to elevate people to be at the same level. Racism exists across. I mean, this is what, again, going back to this example about the World Conference Against Racism, that was such a powerful movement. And older activists are still sort of caught up in how inspiring that all was, because it was this moment of, oh, we thought maybe it was better in Mexico because, the Afro-Mexicans are fewer in number. But the stories sound so much the same. I'll give you an example. One of the very familiar dynamics across the region, regardless of all these different demographic intensity patterns, is the presumption that Afro-Latinos are not of the nation. So a constant vigilance and a questioning as if they are non-documented from someplace else. They can't possibly be Mexican. They can't possibly be Peruvian. Sing the national song. Show me you really know our country, because blacks are not of our nation. Right? Even though these are people who know no other language, haven't traveled anywhere else, etc. Right? But their blackness itself makes them foreign to the state. And that, unfortunately, is not so different across the region, despite different demographic statistical patterns.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Thank you so much. So for the Afro-Latino kind of identity, I'm thinking about in Latin America, you were talking about those mixed communities. For folks who identify as Afro-Latino, is that a self-identification? Because it seems like, you have them mixed in families with white appearing Latino. So I guess, how are they labeled Afro-Latino by society, or are they self-identifying? Like what, I guess, because it seems like there's such a, I don't know if a gradient is the right word, and if you know what I mean, and it's not just in Latin America, it's in the US as well, but like, is it all self-identification? Like, how does that come about?
Well, this all depends on context. So when it comes to outsider perspectives, right, then there is sort of systematic labeling. So meaning third-party viewers, a census taker, a police officer filling out forms is very quick to be able to identify that's a black one, that's a white one, that's a mulatto one, because Latin America, we do use the language of mixture. Right? Yet, when it comes to self-identity within families, what is somewhat different than the United States is we have this sort of dualism where there's a rhetoric of, oh, we're all mixed, but some of us are better than others. And the lighter you are, the better you are. Right? So that blackness is not necessarily always thought of as endemic to the entire family, just to particular members where it shows up more. It's more about the visual mark right, than it is about the ancestral tie. Okay. But that too has been changing. And changing because of the advent of black social justice movements trying to lift up the ways in which there are these patterns of exclusion and bias and systemic hierarchy, that really need to be addressed. And so through that advocacy, what there is a greater embrace. Just like, in the 1970s in the United States, the Black is Beautiful movement in many respects was a kind of a racial consciousness raising in order to give people a sense of community and commonality and self-esteem in what otherwise was being, shall we say, it's a terrible term, denigrated, right? Because even within the language of denigrated, we've got the anti-Blackness. And so for Latin Americans and Latin American families and Latino families who are here, there is this shift, right? That also, but what I'm describing, right, is these families where there's the array of the skin colors, right? What people often, they fixate on that, sometimes they exoticize it, this idea of all the different skin shades. But we also have, what my young people call blackity black families. That is to say, you see them on the street, the entire family is very dark skinned, the entire family is identifiably Black, and they identify themselves as Black as well. So it's not just only the sort of huge skin shade range, but also unambiguously Black families are present as well. I mean, in fact, this is part of why here we go. Sorry about this. There we go. When I wrote this earlier book on Latin America itself, I purposely used news footage. Right? This is not some artistic photograph or what have you. This is a newspaper image of a Afro-Colombian woman working in the mines. In her job site with all the mess or what have you. And what I felt when I saw the image, I was so taken with it because she both was unambiguously Black, right, of Latin America, of Colombia to be specific, and also her whole sort of posture and physicality was sort of announcing what I wanted the book to be announcing, like, I'm here, I exist, I'm Black, deal with it. And so this notion that, it's so much different, it's so different, that Blackness is so different in Latin America is an overstatement, is what I would say. And then the last other point that I will make is that, even for the families where there isn't this unambiguous Blackness, there's more of these sort of various shades, and maybe not necessarily a recognition, right, of the way in which it's very much tied to Blackness. There's oftentimes an invented indigeneity. Like, some Latin Americans are actually of indigenous origins. Many others, though, are of what they fantasize is of indigenous origin because they feel like there's a softer way than saying Black. But sociologists have done some fantastic work within the region where what they have documented systematically from a quantitative perspective are the ways in which the darker you are, regardless of what the person calls you or what you call yourself, but the darker you are, the more your socioeconomic status is impaired across Latin America. And the way they did this, in case you're curious, this is the work of Edward Teles and his collaborators, a book called Pigmentocracies. It's really interesting. They interviewed people about, do you own your home? Do you have an education? What's your educational status? All those sociological questions, right? Survey data. And they had the people identify themselves, and how do you, identify yourself racially, or what skin color do you call yourself, what have you. And they also had the interviewers trained to also do their own identification, unbeknownst to the interviewee. They had a little chart, a little paleta of skin color shades. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to describe the individuals. And so taking that data together, they were able to see from a quantitative perspective the harm that darkness does in exclusion. It also was an interesting follow-up to studies of twins in families. And so this is the last point I'll make about this question. Where you have the skin shade differential within families, what has been documented are the ways in which, despite being twins, not necessarily identical, but twins nonetheless, they do not receive necessarily the same treatment. Right? That time and time again, the lighter twin gets all the familial resources and all the familial investment and care and nurturing. whereas the darker skinned twin is sort of left to their own devices. And that you can then track this across their adult lives as to the ways in which the material economic status is distinct, despite you would have thought same family, same food, same resources and what have you. And I sort of land on that last point because people often think of the skin shade differential as sort of being a softer kind of racial bias, or one that doesn't seem concrete enough to really be concerned with it. Maybe it's just about aesthetics. Some people, they think they're more beautiful if they straighten their hair, and they think that's innocuous. And what they lose sight of is how accumulatively all these things add up to a significant way of being harmed within your social structure. Right? Those are the kids that don't make it to college. Those are the kids who, are part of the school to prison pipeline.
Thank you so much. And we are a little past 7 o'clock now, but I thought we could end with, our audience is always curious about what they can do for these kinds of issues. So do you have any advice for folks at home about how they can better understand these issues or even start to help dismantle this kind of racial hierarchy thinking that seems so embedded in a community? Any advice or resources that you can point people to?
Oh, I should have done another slide. Because there are resources. Online free resources, if you want to buy a copy of the book, right? And although, let me also give you my contact information so that you all know how to find me more easily. Oop, wrong slide. That was for nothing. Okay, here we go. There's my contact information at the bottom. You can find me on Twitter. The Afro-Latino Forum, if you just throw into the website Afro-Latino forum.org, that is a website that has readings, a bibliography, videos, all kinds of multimedia resources, and activism. So, things that you can sort of be a part of in the struggle against anti-Blackness within the Latino community. Another website that is has a good set of resources is called Black Latinas Know. Because Black Latinas know things. So Black Latinas Know. I don't think they're .org. I think they may be a .com. But you Google Black Latinas Know, it's going to come right up. And they have a similar set of resources and also blog posts where they sort of detail in a very concrete, sharing heartfelt concerns, right? That are trying to create a racial literacy such that each of us can be more informed, but also then better equipped and skilled at being able to broach these kind of conversations. Right? It's very hard to do this if it feels that all you have is a sense of something's not quite right, but no language or grammar to express how to move forward. And so that it's better to do this as part of a collective. And if it's not in your community, we have internet communities where we are together doing this. So those are two immediate places. There are a growing collection of young people on Instagram and TikTok who are also trying to do sort of part of this public education where you can find lots of resources as well.
That's wonderful. So there's a lot of resources that people can look into. Thank you so much for sharing that, Professor Hernandez. And for our audience, if you would like to meet Professor Hernandez in person, there's going to be a program this Saturday at 10 a.m. at the Carver Museum and Cultural Center in South Phoenix. So I hope you all can join us in person. We'll also have copies of Professor Hernandez's book there too, and there will be a book signing. So if you are in the Phoenix area, please join us this Saturday. And that's all for tonight, everyone. Have a good night.
And it'll be a different conversation too.